In the final days of his presidency, on January 17, 1961, Dwight D. Eisenhower stepped in front of the American people, not to claim victory, but to sound an alarm. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. With that phrase, Eisenhower gave a name to something massive, sprawling, and dangerously powerful. A web of defense contractors, military officials, and lawmakers, a structure he had helped build, that had, in his view, begun to threaten the very democracy it claimed to defend. I'm your host David, and today we are going to talk about the formation and effects and impacts of the American military-industrial complex. This is the Cold War. Okay, so Ike's warning wasn't a warning about bombs or budgets. It was about what happens when the economy, the government, and the national identity all orbit around war. Historian Dolores Yanevsky notes that Eisenhower delivered his address at a time when media hype over the so-called missile gap had already exaggerated Soviet power, and domestic politics had turned military strength into a campaign slogan. His farewell address, Yanevsky writes, was not just rhetorical, it was his final effort to warn the nation again of the danger of these developments. But what exactly were those developments? And why did Eisenhower, a five-star general, a wartime hero, and the supreme Allied commander, feel the need to caution against the very system he helped create? Well, because he saw what it was becoming. According to political scientist William Hartung, by the 1950s, the lines between the military and industry had blurred almost beyond recognition. What began as a wartime partnership had metastasized into a permanent feature of American life. It was an arrangement that pumped billions into private companies, embedded weapons production in nearly every state, and tied congressional votes to defense dollars. Eisenhower even had a term for it, misplaced power. And he feared that this power, if left unchecked, could reshape the United States not only militarily or economically, but politically, socially, and even geographically. Which, well, it did. This episode tells the story of how the military-industrial complex rewired America, how Cold War fears and defense contracts redrew the political map, how suburban sprawl, factory jobs, and congressional pork turned war into a lifestyle, and how long after Eisenhower's cameras turned off, the machine he warned us about just kept running. The phrase military-industrial complex didn't just appear out of thin air in 1961. It was the product of years, decades really, of institutional growth, economic entrenchment, and political accommodation. And perhaps the most ironic part of the story is that the man who warned us about it helped build it. So, during the Second World War, the US government transformed the economy. Factories that once made refrigerators and radios were retooled to build tanks and bombers. Companies like Ford, General Motors, Boeing, and DuPont became engines of war production, the arsenal of democracy. It was total mobilization, and it worked. But as Thomas Lassman notes, this wartime mobilization created long-established institutional relationships between military departments and private firms that didn't dissolve after the fighting stopped. In fact, the opposite happened. In 1946, before he even entered the White House, then Army Chief of Staff Eisenhower helped institutionalize one of the earliest attempts at permanent military scientific collaboration, the Army's Research and Development Division. This was a bold move, a formal effort to integrate civilian science into the permanent structure of the military. But it also represented a shift from wartime emergency to peacetime permanence. Lassman observes that the Cold War strengthened and permanently deepened these relationships, effectively transforming defense into a pillar of the post-war American economy. By the 1950s, a new system had taken hold, one in which the government, military, and private defense firms became codependent. Historian James Fallows described it as a vast web of influence that had been woven, one that blurred the lines between public service, private profit, and political power. Eisenhower was aware of it all, and he was uneasy. Dolores Yanevsky argues that Eisenhower's farewell address was the product of a long internal struggle. It was drafted not by a single speechwriter, but by a rotating cast that included his brother Milton, speechwriter Malcolm Moose, and advisor Bruce Harlow. The speech reflected Eisenhower's growing discomfort with the scale of defense spending, the rise of Cold War hysteria, and what he saw as an opportunistic fear-mongering over false crises. like the so-called missile gap that had haunted the late 1950s. Yanevsky writes that the address was his final effort to warn the nation again of the danger of these developments. But here's the paradox. Even as Eisenhower prepared to leave office with a warning, his administration had helped create the very infrastructure he now feared. As Charles Dunlap points out, by the time Eisenhower spoke, the military-industrial complex was already a dominant force in American governance. Its momentum was sustained not just by necessity, but by political convenience, economic dependence, and ideological certainty. And Eisenhower knew it. He didn't call for dismantling it. He didn't suggest cutting off contracts or shuttering bases. What he asked for was vigilance. To quote Ike, "Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals." It wasn't the existence of the MIC that scared him, it was his influence. Its ability to shift national priorities, to override democratic debate, to funnel public money into private hands without scrutiny or resistance. The machinery was built, the gears were turning, and Eisenhower, standing on the threshold of retirement, issued a final plea: keep your eyes open. Because what comes next won't be decided in a war room, it'll be decided in the halls of Congress, the boardrooms of Lockheed and General Dynamics, and the living rooms of voters who depend on defense jobs to pay their mortgages. This wasn't a distant threat, it was here, it was real, and it wasn't going anywhere. Okay, so we also need to consider that the Cold War didn't just militarize American foreign policy, it militarized the American landscape. From California to Florida, the United States saw an explosion of new suburbs, highways, and factories during the 1950s and 60s. But this wasn't just post-war prosperity, it was the spatial blueprint of the military-industrial complex. Historian Jeffrey Hooks calls this transformation Cold War urbanism, the process by which defense spending physically reshaped US cities, economies, and demographics. He writes that Cold War priorities reshaped not only federal policy, but the built environment of the United States itself. Defense contractors and military bases became economic lifelines for entire regions, especially in the American South and West. This is where the map changes. During the New Deal era, political and economic power was concentrated in the industrial Northeast and Midwest. But by the 1960s, a new axis of influence had emerged in the so-called Gun Belt, a term that played on the Sun Belt description, but instead described the arc of defense-dependent communities stretching from Southern California through Texas to the Southeast. Thomas Engel notes that federal defense spending played a pivotal role in what he calls the subsidization of regional transformation. Sunbelt states, often previously underdeveloped or rural, saw massive growth as the government funneled money into missile silos, air bases, shipyards, and high-tech research labs. And it wasn't just about factories, it was about identity. Suburban communities grew up around defense plants and military bases. These were not the same as the more diverse working-class neighborhoods of the industrial North. They were newer, wealthier, whiter, and more politically conservative. They were built by and for the Cold War economy. Hooks explains that, quote, "These were spaces where militarism, race, and suburbia intersected, creating bastions of defense-driven prosperity that were often closed off to broader calls for racial or economic justice." In other words, the MIC didn't just bankroll fighter jets, it bankrolled a specific vision of America. This was a vision rooted in Cold War capitalism, single-family homes, car-dependent communities, and a growing professional class of engineers, scientists, and administrators whose livelihoods were tied directly to defense contracts. Engel refers to this as military Keynesianism, the use of defense spending as a tool to stimulate the economy, all while bypassing the ideological and political resistance faced by domestic welfare programs. The system created a new kind of civic dependency. Local economies, schools, and housing markets all hinged on the continuation of Cold War spending. A canceled missile system didn't just mean fewer weapons, it meant lost jobs, declining tax revenues, and political backlash. That dependency wasn't accidental either, it was strategic. As William Harting notes, defense contractors intentionally spread subcontracting across multiple congressional districts to ensure that virtually no major weapons program could be cut without causing political pain in dozens of states. By the 1980s, major defense systems like the B-1 bomber and the F-15 fighter jet were being built in as many as 44 different states at once. This wasn't just about securing the best designs or most efficient construction, it was about securing votes. And the result? the geography of the Cold War became a geography of power. Places that benefited from defense dollars gained political weight. Those that didn't were left behind. This new map wasn't drawn with borders or battleships, it was drawn with contracts and cement. And once the dollars started flowing and the jobs were secured, Congress didn't just sign the checks, they became an indispensable part of the machine. Let's come back to Eisenhower's 1961 warning. He specifically called out the military-industrial complex. However, he had originally planned to say more. Early drafts of the speech included a third word, congressional. What he and his advisors knew, what they debated behind the scenes, was that Congress wasn't just a bystander in the rise of the MIC. It was a partner, an enabler, a stakeholder. As Dolores Janevsky explains, Eisenhower and his aides were fully aware that Congress was a central node in the web of political and economic interests sustaining the MIC. But they feared that naming Congress directly would seem too combative or politically controversial, so it got cut. But the omission didn't change the reality. By the 1950s, Congress had become the third wheel that kept the machine running. Legislators quickly discovered that military contracts could be turned into political capital. Every airbase, shipyard, or missile facility brought with it jobs, tax revenue, and grateful voters. As military spending surged during the Korean War and then again under Kennedy and Reagan, so did the pork barrel logic of defense procurement. Historian Charles Dunlap describes this relationship as a symbiotic triangle in which no side, military, industry, or legislature, has an incentive to stop the growth of defense budgets. Quite the opposite, every party benefits when the spending continues. It wasn't just about supporting the troops, it was about securing the contracts. And the system was built to ensure that no major program could be easily cut. William Hartung details how defense contractors deliberately spread subcontracting across as many congressional districts as possible, creating what he calls ironclad constituencies for continued spending. The logic was simple. If you build a jet in 44 states, then any effort to cancel it faces resistance from 44 members of Congress. The F-22 Raptor is one of the most notorious examples. At one point, its production was distributed across nearly every region of the country, not because it made engineering sense, but because it made political sense. Cutting the program would have meant layoffs in multiple districts, and no lawmaker wants to be the one who killed jobs back home. Alex Mintz calls this the MIC's recursive logic. As Congress funds more military projects, more constituents become economically dependent on them, which in turn increases pressure on Congress to continue funding them. And it's not a conspiracy, it's a self-sustaining ecosystem. And that ecosystem created more than just jobs. It created loyalty. Lawmakers who secured defense contracts became known as protectors of national security, even if the systems they championed were outdated or unnecessary. The logic of defense equals patriotism became a bipartisan default. Questioning a weapons program could open you up to accusations of weakness, or worse, disloyalty. As Hooks and Engel argue, defense spending became a substitute for broader social investment. It was easier to win support for a missile system than for public housing or education. The MIC didn't just influence what America did, it influenced what America ignored. By the time Eisenhower gave his warning, the structure was already cemented. But it wasn't just a matter of collusion or corporate greed. It was about the political survival of elected officials who had learned that in Cold War America, nothing got you re-elected faster than bringing the defense dollars home. By the early 1960s, the United States had constructed the most powerful military in the world. It had global bases, nuclear arsenals, standing armies, and fleets of ships and bombers. But it had also constructed something else, a sprawling domestic infrastructure of contracts, factories, alliances, and influence. And that came with a cost. Eisenhower's concern wasn't simply that the military-industrial complex existed, it's that its growing power could endanger our liberties or democratic processes and lead to the disastrous rise of misplaced power. A power that didn't just shape budgets, it was the one that shaped national priorities. As Thomas Engel argues, military spending became the dominant form of public investment in the post-war US, often crowding out alternative forms of social and economic development. He described this as militarized Keynesianism, where defense budgets were treated as untouchable, while proposals for public health, education, or housing had to justify themselves against the perceived urgency of national security. In the 1960s, the US spent more on the Vietnam War than on the entire Great Society. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan's Pentagon budgets soared while federal aid to cities was slashed. In the 2000s, the war on terror became the fiscal framework for everything, from surveillance to school militarization. This is what Hartung calls the quiet realignment of priorities, not through overt authoritarianism, but through budgets that steadily tilted towards war and away from care. Fallows describes the MIC not just as an economic machine, but as a moral hazard. In his words, it has the potential to remove real consequences from the decisions of policymakers, who know that whatever the crisis, the solution will involve defense dollars and military contracts. And those dollars disproportionately flowed into communities that already had political leverage: Sunbelt suburbs, white-collar enclaves, aerospace hubs, and so on. But by doing so, they tended to bypass the urban poor, particularly Black and Brown Americans, whose neighborhoods were seldom home to high-tech defense jobs. Jeffrey Hooks observed that Cold War militarism was not racially neutral. Instead, it often reinforced spatial and economic segregation by prioritizing infrastructure that served white suburban voters. So this isn't just a Cold War story, it's a domestic policy story, one that shaped who got resources, who got representation, and who got left behind. Meanwhile, as Charles Dunlap argues, the political incentives for sustaining the MIC remained intact even after the Cold War ended. Defense contractors merged into even larger conglomerates, lobbying intensified, and military priorities adapted to new fears: terrorism, cyber threats, China, and so on, without ever confronting the fundamental question Eisenhower had raised: what happens to democracy when the gears of government and the gears of war are fused together? Eisenhower's farewell address didn't ask Americans to abolish the military or even cut the budget. He asked for something far more radical: vigilance. So, were Americans alert? Not really. Generally speaking, people became accustomed to the logic that military spending equals safety, war readiness equals job creation, and patriotism equals unquestioning support for the Pentagon. And so the MIC persisted, not because it was imposed from above, but because it became woven into the fabric of how America understood itself. Not a temporary Cold War adaptation, but a permanent feature of the American state. In a democracy, power is supposed to be temporary, but the military-industrial complex proved that if you make power profitable, it never leaves. When Ike gave his final address in January 1961, he wasn't just signing off after 8 years in the White House. He was passing the torch, and a warning along with it. One final urgent plea to a nation that had just spent 2 decades becoming something new, a country permanently at war with the idea of peace. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. He wasn't talking about tanks rolling down Pennsylvania Avenue. He was talking about budgets passed without scrutiny, wars waged without strategy, and institutions grown too large to question. He was talking about what happens when a democracy outsources its economy, its priorities, and its political will to a machine built for perpetual conflict. And 60 years later, that machine is still running. The military-industrial complex did not fade with the end of the Cold War. Didn't retire after Vietnam or shrink after Iraq. It adapted, it globalized, it rebranded. It found new threats, new partners, and new ways to stay indispensable. Today, the line between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon is thinner than ever. Private defense contractors don't just build missiles, they write code, run surveillance networks, and manage logistics. The war economy is no longer confined to factories and bases. It lives in the cloud. It lives in politics. It lives in the assumption that military spending is patriotic, that questioning of war is naive, that security always means weapons, and never health, education, or housing. Eisenhower warned that this was not just about budgets, it was about values, about whether the government of the people would stay in the hands of the people, or drift, slowly but steadily, into the hands of a few powerful institutions whose profits depended on permanent mobilization. Ike didn't fear a coup. He warned against complacency. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals. The question 60 years later is whether people are alert enough, whether they're knowledgeable enough, whether they're willing to look beyond the rhetoric of security and ask themselves what it means to live in a democracy that can't stop preparing for war. After all, the machine didn't die with the Cold War, it evolved, and Ike's warning still stands more relevant than ever. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which is lobbying Congress to build a network of bell button factories across all 50 states. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.